This is the first of 4 lectures on the Gilded Age. In the first 2 lectures, we'll be looking primarily at inventions, industrialization, and the rise of big businesses. So that will be the first 2 lectures. And in the last 2 lectures, we'll shift our attention to thinking about the political sphere and in some ways the relationship between industrialization, urbanization, and how that shaped the politics of the Gilded Age. So let us begin today with first inventors. Okay, so in this lecture, we'll be looking at the big ideas and new products that inventors of the late 19th century contributed, and in some ways how that relate to the rise of big businesses. So I hope that by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to think about how the inventions of the late 19th century changed everyday life in America. And as we move into the second lecture, I would also like you to think about how these new inventions contributed to industrial growth. Okay, so we are now moving into a period of American history that the American author Mark Twain has famously called the Gilded Age. Okay, and so we're starting with this image. In some ways, I think it's a really nice image that captures some of the main spirit of the Gilded Age. You see the invention of light bulb, as well as the expansion of railroads, and how all of that contributed to the rapid rise of communication, transportation, and that's deeply connected to the growth of industrialization, urbanization, of course, backed by newly arrived immigrants, and where they participate in these new counters of American life. Okay, so in the late 19th century, America found itself in the grip of an invention fever, with more people working on their big ideas than ever before. So to help us understand the scope of this zeal for creation, let's take, for example, the US Patent Office, which in 1790 recorded only 276 inventions. But between 1860 and 1890, that number exploded to nearly 450,000. And another 235,000 was recorded in the last decade of the century. New inventions fueled industrial growth around the country. As late as 1880, about 1/2 of all Americans still lived and worked on farms, whereas fewer than 1 in every 7 were employed in the factories. However, the development of commercial electricity by the close of the century, which we'll come back to momentarily, permitted more industries to concentrate in cities, right? So this was possible because it moved them away from the previously essential water power. In turn, newly arrived immigrants sought employment in new urban factories. So it's kind of like the combination of immigration, urbanization, and industrialization, how they coincided to transform the face of American society from primarily rural to significantly urban. Again, just to give you a sense of the degree of urbanization, from 1880 to 1920, the number of industrial workers in the nation quadrupled from 2.5 million to over 10 million. And over the same period of time, urban populations doubled to reach 1/2 of the country's total population. In offices, worker productivity benefited from the typewriter, invented in 1867, the cash register, invented in 1879, and the adding machine, which came out in 1885. These tools made it easier to keep up with the rapid pace of business growth. Inventions also greatly and slowly transformed domestic life. Homes were transformed as a result. The vacuum cleaner arrived during this era, as well as the flush toilet. Right? These inventions improved the quality of public health. Tin cans, for example, and frozen food eventually changed how women shopped for and prepared food for their families. But perhaps the most important industrial advancement of the era came in the production of steel. Manufacturers and builders prefer steel to iron due to its increased strength and durability. After the Civil War, new processes allow for the creation of furnaces large enough and hot enough to melt the wrought iron needed to produce large quantities of steel at increasingly cheaper prices. Right? You can see from the PowerPoint here, this is precisely the product of invention in the Gilded Age. And as a result, when quality steel became cheaper and more readily available, other industries relied upon it more heavily as a key to their growth and development. For example, construction, and eventually, as we will see, the automotive industry. So as a result, the steel industry rapidly became the cornerstone of the American economy. It remained the primary indicator of industrial growth and stability through the end of World War II. Advancements in communication matched the pace of growth that we saw in industry and home life. Communication technologies were changing quickly, and they brought with them new ways for information to travel. One of the greatest advancements was the telephone, which Alexander Bell patented in 1876. Although he was not the first to invent this concept, Bell was actually the first one to capitalize on it. After securing the patent, he worked with financiers and businessmen to create the National Bell Telephone Company. With the communications industry now largely in their control and the federal government behind them, the Bell Company was transformed into the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which still exists today as AT&T. By 1880, 50,000 telephones were in use in the United States, including one at the White House, and by 1900, hundreds of American cities had obtained local service for their citizens. Technology was bringing the country into closer contact, now changing forever the rural isolation that had defined America since its beginnings. Next comes electrical lighting. Although Thomas Edison is best known for his contributions to the electrical industry, his experiments went far beyond the light bulb. Edison was quite possibly the greatest inventor of the term century. He is well known for having said that, quote, he hoped to have a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every month or so. He registered over 1,000 patents over his lifetime and ran a world-famous laboratory known as the Menlo Park, which housed a rotating group of up to 25 scientists from around the world. In 1879, Edison invented the item that has led to his greatest fame, that is the light bulb. He allegedly explored over 6,000 different materials for the filament before stumbling upon tungsten as the most ideal substance. By 1882, with financial backing largely from financier J.P. Morgan, again, we'll come back to this in greater detail in the next lecture, Edison created the Edison Electric Illuminating Company, which eventually evolved into the Edison General Electric Company in 1889. The next stage of invention in electric power came about with the contribution of George Westinghouse. Westinghouse was responsible for making electric lighting possible on a national scale. While Edison used direct current or DC power, which could only extend 2 miles from the power source, in 1886, Westinghouse invented the AC power, or the alternating current. This allowed for the delivery over greater distances due to its wave-like patterns. The Westinghouse Electric Company delivered AC power, which meant that factories, houses, and farms could be served regardless of their proximity to the power source. Although Edison originally fought the use of AC power in other devices, he reluctantly adapted to it as its popularity increased. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and to think really critically about what railroads expansion in this period meant and how that kind of gave rise to big businesses. In fact, as you'll see, the railroad network was perhaps the first important big business in the nation. In terms of the technologies that we just discussed so far, their exploitation provided the opportunities for tremendous growth. And business entrepreneurs with enough financial backing could now make fortunes. Some of these new millionaires were known in their days as robber barons. This is a negative term that connotes the belief that these people exploited workers and bent laws to succeed. The railroad industry quickly became the nation's first big business, a powerful, inexpensive, and consistent form of transportation. Railroads accelerated the development of virtually every other industry in the country. So as you can see from this map kind of compares the build of major railroads in 1870s. So this is highlighted with the orange lines, right? The railroad lines are highlighted in orange versus the green lines, which indicate the major railroads built between 1870 and 1890. So for example, you want to think about in 1870, where in the West Coast was the only place that was connected to the Midwest and the eastern part of the United States, and how that transformed substantially over the course of 2 decades, right? With the rise of these green line railroad systems, what does it mean for American culture? Jay Gould was perhaps the most prominent railroad magnate to be termed the robber baron in this period. He bought older, smaller, and rundown railroads. He offered minimal improvement and then capitalized on factory owners' desires to ship their goods on this increasingly popular and more cost-efficient form of transportation. So he was very well known to drive companies to near ruins in failed attempts to attract foreign investors during a takeover attempt. In adding to owning the Union Pacific Railroad. Remember, that was important to construct the first transcontinental railroad line, which we learned from the last lesson. Jay Gould came to control over 10,000 miles of track across the United States. This accounts for 15% of all railroad transportation. When he died in 1892, Gould had a personal worth of over $100 million. Although, as you can see from this cartoon illustration, he was a deeply unpopular figure. Okay, so I think there's actually, in terms of this illustration, by the way, you can see how it tries to depict Gould in terms of as a spider. And think about what is the metaphor here, right? What does the spider web suggest? Why is the justice system, right, the courthouse, either at the center or at the very, how do I put it? It's right beneath the spider web, right? It's not getting out. And how is that spider web reaching out to all these different kind of fences? And so what does this illustration trying to suggest? The image of Gould in the Gilded Age. Okay, so I'll stop the lecture here, and next time we'll continue to look at three giants of wealth in particular, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, to look deeply in their stories and what they can tell us about the rise of big businesses in this period.